It feels like every time I check the news lately, I need a whole afternoon just to process it.
Oh, tell me about it.
And with the election just around the corner, things are really starting to heat up.
Definitely heating up.
So today's deep dive is especially fascinating.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at policies, we're actually analyzing behavior.
Exactly.
Observing how candidates act, especially under pressure, can be just as telling as their stated platforms.
Absolutely. You can learn a lot from how people behave when the heat is on.
So we're diving into some recent Donald Trump appearances that have everyone talking.
Okay.
First up, he was at an economic forum in Chicago hosted by Bloomberg.
Right. I heard about this one.
You would expect a pretty buttoned-up environment.
Yeah. I mean, in that setting, you'd anticipate a focus on economic policy.
Yeah, for sure. But instead of sticking to the script, he goes on these tangents.
Oh, really?
It's like his train of thought just leaves the station.
Interesting.
Now, everyone misspeaks occasionally.
Sure, it happens.
But this felt different.
Right. How so?
Well, the frequency and severity of these digressions were unusual,
Interesting.
even in the world of politics, which, let's face it, can be pretty rough and tumble.
Yeah, no doubt. So, what are we thinking here? Could this be a sign of something more serious, like cognitive decline?
Potentially. But it's not our place to offer any diagnoses.
Of course, of course.
We're just observing the behavior patterns here.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets really wild.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Usually, when a politician stumbles this much, their team goes into damage control.
Right, the usual playbook, downplay, redirect, the drill.
Exactly. But Trump's aides went in the complete opposite direction.
Oh, really? How so?
They were praising his performance, calling it peak level, and the greatest live interview in our lifetimes.
Wow, that's quite the response.
It makes you wonder, are we living in the same reality? Who are they trying to convince?
It's like they're trying to convince themselves more than anyone else at this point.
Right. Okay, so if the economic forum was strange, his town hall in Pennsylvania went full-on Twilight Zone.
Okay, I gotta hear about this. What happened?
This time, it wasn't even about the policies discussed, but the overall vibe of the event.
So town halls, they typically involve a lot of engagement with voters and in-depth policy discussions.
Yeah, exactly. This one had a short Q&A and then music.
Music?
Yeah, and not just any music, music that seemed to confuse even Trump himself.
Really?
Yeah, he even asked what songs about music that he's supposedly requested.
Wow, that's bizarre.
And once again, his team's response was more telling than the event itself.
How so?
They tried to reinterpret what happened instead of acknowledging the apparent confusion.
It's like they're trying to gaslight us, saying that didn't just happen.
Exactly. And this is especially jarring when you compare it to Kamala Harris's town hall, which took place around the same time.
Oh, and interesting. What was different about hers?
Hers had a completely different energy. Focused, policy-driven, and direct.
Okay.
There was even this moment where she addressed the whole idea of being scripted.
What did she say?
She said, that's called discipline. Love it or hate it, you can't deny the contrast in their communication styles.
For sure, for sure.
Trump's events felt almost chaotic, while Harris's was very controlled.
It really makes you think about what resonates with voters, right?
Totally.
Is one style inherently better, or does it come down to the audience and what they're seeking in a leader?
That's a fascinating question.
It really is. Yeah, it's a question that political scientists have debated for years.
Oh, totally.
But before we get too far down that rabbit hole,
Right.
let's pivot back to the content of these events for a second.
Okay.
You highlighted Harris's focus on policy in her town hall, which itself stands in stark contrast to what we saw from Trump.
Totally. It's like they're working from completely different playbooks.
It seems that way.
And then there was that very specific accusation from Harris about Trump sending COVID tests to Putin.
Right. I remember that.
If that's true,
yeah,
the implications are huge.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a pivotal moment in the pandemic when tests were scarce here in the U.S.
Exactly.
So if those claims are accurate, that could point to some serious inconsistencies in policy and messaging from back then.
Yeah, and it raises questions about the prioritization of resources at the time.
For sure.
And maybe even, foreign policy considerations during a global health crisis.
Yeah. Definitely something worth looking into.
Feels like there's a whole other deep dive we could do just on that.
Oh, easily.
But it speaks to something you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
About the importance of digging into the details and looking beyond the surface.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most revealing information is hidden in plain sight.
Totally. Speaking of things that are hidden in plain sight,
yeah,
I also wanted to get your take on what's happening outside of these big Trump and Harris events.
Okay.
I'm thinking specifically about some of the clips I shared from Georgia and Texas.
Right. You were particularly struck by those early voting numbers coming out of Georgia.
Yeah, over 300,000 people voted on the first day.
Wow.
It just shows how engaged people are in this election.
Yeah, it really does.
Especially in a state that has become such a political battleground.
Absolutely.
And then there's that clip from the Texas Senate race between Colin Allred and Ted Cruz.
Oh, yeah. What about it?
That moment where Allred called out Cruz on abortion rights was electric.
It was a really powerful moment, for sure.
It's easy to become cynical about politics.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, I know.
Like to just assume everything is calculated and performative.
Right.
But then you see a moment of raw, genuine emotion like that.
Yeah.
And it reminds you that these issues have real-world consequences.
Right, for sure.
You know, Allred wasn't just talking about the issue.
Right.
He was speaking directly to women in Texas, sharing their stories and struggles.
Yeah.
It felt so personal, such a stark contrast to the almost theatrical nature of the Trump events we were discussing.
Yeah, it really highlights the enduring power of connecting with voters on a personal level.
Totally.
Speaking to the issues that directly impact their lives.
Yes.
And it brings us back to that tension we keep encountering.
Yeah.
This tension between authenticity and performance in politics.
How are we as voters supposed to navigate that?
It's a tough one.
It's like trying to make sense of a hall of mirrors.
It really is. It's more crucial now than ever to be discerning consumers of information.
I agree.
I mean, we're bombarded with messages, narratives, often conflicting accounts of the same event.
All the time.
So how do we cut through the noise?
It feels overwhelming sometimes, to be honest.
I understand. It can feel like you're drowning in information.
Yeah.
But the key is to develop a critical lens, a healthy skepticism toward everything you encounter.
Okay.
Especially in the political sphere.
So how do we even begin to cut through all that noise?
Well, it starts with questioning everything, you know?
Okay.
Don't accept anything at face value.
Especially in politics, right?
Especially in politics, right?
Yeah.
Dig deeper, look for evidence, and be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
Sounds like that old saying,
Yeah.
if it sounds too good to be true.
Exactly. And the same goes for anything designed to trigger outrage or fear.
Right.
Those emotions, they can really cloud our judgment.
For sure.
And make us more susceptible to manipulation.
Yeah, you just get so reactive, you don't even realize it's happening.
So take a step back, breathe, try to see the bigger picture.
It's tough, though, with this 24/7 news cycle, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
It's relentless.
It is, but it's not just about what we're consuming. It's also about how we're engaging with the information.
That's true. That's a good point.
And part of that is being aware of our own biases.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone has them.
We all have them, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
So ask yourself,
What
are my preconceived notions about these candidates or these issues?
Yeah.
And are those biases affecting my judgment?
That's a good question to ask yourself.
Yeah, it's about bringing that self-awareness to everything we see and hear, especially during an election.
So basically, we got to be extra vigilant, you know?
Exactly. It's not enough to just listen to sound bites or scroll through headlines.
Yeah.
We have to actually engage with the information critically and think for ourselves.
It's a lot of work, but important work.
It is. It really is. But it's essential for a functioning democracy.
You know, it's funny. I mean, not funny.
Right.
Huh.
Right.
But thinking back to where we started this deep dive.
Yeah.
You were feeling uneasy about this upcoming election and just the state of our political discourse.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are feeling that way.
Totally. It's a crazy time.
And we've seen how these candidates are presenting themselves, how they're communicating, and how those approaches might resonate with different voters.
It's fascinating to observe.
And we've also talked about the importance of, like, looking beyond the surface, digging into those details, and just being critical consumers of all this information that's out there.
Because ultimately, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
But not just any knowledge. It has to be informed knowledge.
Knowledge that's gained through careful consideration and a healthy dose of skepticism.
So I guess as we head into these final weeks before the election.
Yeah.
Eyes wide open, everyone.
Eyes wide open, minds engaged.
And don't forget to vote.
The most important thing.
Couldn't agree more.